Hello?
Come in here. My parents went into town.
No.
Yeah. They went to call my grandma for Christmas.
No, I mean, we can't do that.
Why not?
You want to do something together?
The narrative of Christopher McCandless begins in May 1990 at Emory University in Atlanta. The air is thick with the scent of tradition and the heavy expectations of the elite. Chris stands among his peers, a young man who has achieved everything society deems necessary for success. He is an honors student, a gifted athlete, and the son of wealthy, influential parents. As he walks across the stage to receive his diploma, his sister Corrine watches him from the stands. Her narration provides the first glimpse into Chris's internal world. She knows that this graduation isn't a beginning for him, but a final exit. After the ceremony, the family gathers for a celebratory dinner at a high-end restaurant. It is here that the fundamental rift between Chris and his parents, Walt and Billy, becomes an impassable canyon. Walt and Billy, wanting to reward Chris for his academic excellence, offer to buy him a brand new, expensive car to replace his aging yellow Datsun. Chris's reaction is one of quiet, simmering disgust. He doesn't see a generous gift. He sees a shackle designed to pull him deeper into a materialist culture he finds morally bankrupt. He tells them his Datsun is a great car and that he has no interest in things. He dismisses their offer as an attempt to buy his future and pull him into a life of corporate compliance. This dinner is the catalyst. Shortly after, Chris performs his final acts of defiance. He visits his bank and arranges to donate his entire life savings, over $24,000 intended for law school, to Oxfam. He writes a final, vague letter to his parents, packs a few books and a backpack into his Datsun, and drives west. He is seeking what he calls the ultimate adventure, a life of total freedom where he is the only master of his fate. Chris drives toward the horizon, his yellow Datsun carrying him away from the life he hated. While camping in the Arizona desert, a sudden, violent flash flood disables his vehicle in a dry wash. Rather than seeking a mechanic or calling his parents for help, Chris views this as a divine signal from the universe. He removes the license plates, hides the car under a tarp, and buries his few remaining possessions in the sand. In a moment of radical, symbolic liberation, he takes a match to his paper money and watches his last connection to the human economy turn to ash. He is no longer Christopher McCandless. He adopts the new identity of Alexander Supertramp. This act of burning his cash is a crucial turning point in the film. It signifies his total rejection of society and his commitment to a life lived entirely on his own terms. He begins hitchhiking, surviving on his wits and the kindness of the rubber tramps and leather tramps he meets on the road. He wanders through the American West, experiencing the raw, unfiltered beauty of the landscape that he had previously only read about in the works of Jack London and Henry David Thoreau. He is a young man in love with an ideal, and for a time, the road provides exactly the spiritual nourishment he craves. He seeks the raw experience of life, believing that by stripping away every comfort, he will finally encounter the core of his own spirit. He is seeking truth, but he is doing so with the arrogance of youth, unaware of the neutral indifference of the natural world. In the late summer of 1990, Chris hitches a ride to Carthage, South Dakota, where he meets Wayne Westerberg. Wayne is a rugged, salt-of-the-earth man who runs a commercial grain elevator operation. He offers Chris a job, and the young traveler quickly proves to be an incredibly hard worker. Chris thrives on the physical exhaustion of the grain elevator, finding a sense of honesty in manual labor that he never found in his academic pursuits. He is covered in dust, working long hours in the heat, but he is happier than he ever was in the air-conditioned classrooms of Emory. He and Wayne form a deep bond, and Wayne becomes the first of several replacement father figures Chris encounters on the road. They spend long nights drinking at the local bar and discussing life, philosophy, and the perceived flaws of modern society. Chris explains his plan to head to Alaska, calling it his great Alaskan adventure. He wants to live entirely off the land, free from any human interference or governmental oversight. Wayne, while admiring Chris's spirit and work ethic, is quietly concerned by the boy's lack of practical survival experience. However, their time together is cut short when Wayne is arrested for a minor legal infraction involving satellite descramblers. With Wayne gone and the operation temporarily shut down, Chris decides it is time to move on. He leaves South Dakota with a small amount of cash and a copy of a field guide to edible plants, a gift that he believes will be his key to survival surviving the harsh northern wilderness. Chris's wanderlust eventually leads him to the banks of the Colorado River. Without a permit or any formal training in watercraft, he acquires an old metal canoe and decides to paddle downstream. This sequence is a visual representation of Chris's hubris and his exhilaration. He navigates the river's currents, moving through the ancient, towering walls of the Grand Canyon, feeling like an explorer from a bygone era who has finally escaped the reach of civilization. He eventually reaches the Mexican border, hoping to find the Gulf of California. However, the river's end is not a clear path to the sea, but a confusing, suffocating maze of irrigation canals and stagnant water. Chris spends days lost in this labyrinth, his frustration mounting as the heat and the isolation begin to wear on his psyche. He eventually finds a group of friendly locals who help him transport his canoe to the ocean. After a terrifying encounter with a storm that nearly capsizes his small boat, Chris realizes he is dangerously out of his depth. He abandons the canoe and sneaks back into the United States on foot. He is caught by Border Patrol but manages to talk his way out of serious trouble. This chapter of his life highlights his physical bravery and his total disregard for the rules of society, but it also shows a man who is still unknowingly relying on the safety nets of the world he claims to have rejected. In the California desert, Chris encounters Jan Burrs and her partner Rainey, a couple of rubber tramps who live out of their van. Jan is a motherly figure who is clearly grieving her own estranged son, and she sees Chris's vulnerability beneath his bravado. She takes him under her wing, and they travel together to the Slabs, a massive, lawless community of nomads and outcasts living in the desert. Here, Chris becomes a central figure in the camp, helping Jan sell books at a flea market and performing songs for the other residents. His infectious energy and intelligence draw people to him, and for a moment, he seems to have found a tribe. He meets a young singer named Tracy, who develops a deep crush on him. However, Chris remains emotionally guarded and distant. He refuses to engage in a romantic relationship, fearing that any form of intimacy will derail his ultimate mission to Alaska. He tells Jan that some people feel they don't deserve love, a line that suggests his self-imposed isolation is a form of protection against the trauma of his past. He is running away from the pain of his childhood, and he isn't ready to let anyone into his heart. Jan tries to give him warm clothes and practical advice for his Alaskan trip, sensing that he is woefully underprepared for the sub-zero temperatures. Chris accepts the gear but rejects the emotional connection, believing that to truly find oneself, one must be completely alone and untethered. While Chris is enjoying the freedom of the road, the film provides a haunting look at the family he left behind in Virginia. His sister, Corrine, provides a poignant narration that acts as the bridge between Chris's internal world and the reality of his parents' mounting grief. Through her, we learn that the perfect McCandless family was built on a foundation of systemic lies and emotional volatility. During his college years, Chris had traveled to California and discovered that his father, Walt, had continued a relationship with his first wife long after Chris and Corrine were born. For years, Walt lived a double life, fathering children with two different women simultaneously and keeping them in separate worlds. This discovery was the catalyst for Chris's radicalization and his hatred of authority. He saw his father as a hypocrite who preached morality while living a profound lie. The physical violence between Walt and Billy, which Chris witnessed as a child, only added to his deep-seated resentment. He viewed his entire upbringing as a moral fraud. Corrine explains that Chris's departure wasn't just an adventure, it was an act of purification. He wanted to strip away everything that was false and find something that was real. Back in the present, Walt and Billy are mere shells of their former selves. They have hired private investigators and are spending thousands of dollars to find their son, but Chris has left no trail. The silence of the phone and the emptiness of his bedroom become a daily, psychological torture for them as they realize their wealth and status could not keep their son at home. Perhaps the most impactful relationship Chris forms is with Ron Franz, an 80-year-old widower and military veteran living in Salton City. Ron is a man of routine and quiet faith, spending his days working with leather in a small, tidy shop. When he first encounters Chris, he is skeptical of the boy's Supertramp persona, but he is quickly captivated by Chris's intellect and his passionate defense of his nomadic lifestyle. Chris in turn, is moved by Ron's kindness and the tragedy of his past. Ron lost his wife and only son to a drunk driver decades earlier and never truly recovered from the loss. Chris stays with Ron for several weeks, and a deep grandfather-grandson bond develops between them. Chris works in Ron's workshop, learning the intricate art of leatherworking. He creates a custom belt that tells the story of his travels, carving symbols for the river, the mountains, and his ultimate goal, Alaska. Chris challenges Ron's sedentary life, telling him that the core of a man's spirit comes from new experiences and the courage to leave the familiar behind. In one of the film's most beautiful and heart-wrenching scenes, the two men climb a steep hill together. At the top, looking out over the vast desert, Ron feels a sense of vitality he hasn't felt in 40 years. As the time for Chris's departure to Alaska nears, Ron makes a desperate proposal. He asks if he can adopt Chris as his grandson. Chris, unable to commit to any form of family or permanence, avoids a direct answer. He tells Ron they will discuss it when he returns. Ron gives Chris high-quality camping gear and a heavy winter coat, watching him walk away with tears in his eyes, knowing he may never see the boy again. In April 1992, Chris finally reaches his destination. He is dropped off at the head of the Stampede Trail by a local man named Jim Gallion, who is deeply concerned by what he sees. He notices that Chris's pack is far too light, his rifle is too small for big game, and he lacks even a basic compass or map. Gallion tries to talk him out of the trek, even offering to drive him to Anchorage to buy better gear, but Chris is resolute and almost arrogant in his confidence. He walks into the snow-covered wilderness, crossing the frozen Taclanica River and heading toward the shadows of the mountains. After several days of trekking through the knee-deep snow, he stumbles upon an abandoned 1940s-era International Harvester bus, Bus 142, left behind as a shelter for construction crews. He dubs it the Magic Bus and decides to make it his home. The early weeks in the bus are a period of absolute triumph. Chris is ecstatic, documenting his daily life in his journal with a sense of religious fervor. He hunts small game, squirrels, birds, and porcupines, and gathers berries and roots. He finds peace in the silence and the absolute solitude of the Alaskan interior, believing he has finally escaped the civilized world. He writes about the spiritual revolution he is experiencing and the purity of his new life. The landscape is breathtakingly beautiful, and Chris feels like a king in his own private kingdom. He reads his books by the light of the late-setting sun, finding deep, personal resonance in the words of Tolstoy and Thoreau. He believes he has proven that a man can live entirely on his own terms, free from the interference of others, but he is unaware that nature is merely tolerating his presence. However, the reality of the wild soon begins to assert its dominance over Chris's idealism. The Magic Bus is not a paradise. It is a precarious shelter in a neutral, unforgiving environment. The turning point comes when Chris manages to shoot and kill a large moose. Initially, he is overjoyed, thinking he has secured enough meat to last for the entire summer. But Chris is an amateur in a world that requires expert knowledge. He spends hours trying to butcher the massive animal, but the heat of the Alaskan summer and the swarms of flies are against him. He tries to smoke the meat based on the limited instructions in his book, but he fails. Within days, the carcass is crawling with maggots, and the meat is spoiled. Chris is devastated by the failure. He views the waste of the moose's life as a moral tragedy, and writes in his journal that he wishes he had never shot the animal. This failure marks the beginning of a profound psychological decline. He starts to realize that the wilderness does not care about his philosophy, his truth, or his intentions. It only cares about the brutal mechanics of survival. His weight begins to drop at an alarming rate as the small game becomes harder to find. He spends more time in the bus, his journal entries becoming shorter, more fragmented, and less frequent. The isolation, which once felt like a liberating gift, begins to feel like a heavy, suffocating burden. He starts to experience the first pangs of true loneliness and begins to miss the people he left behind. By July, Chris decides that his adventure is over and that he has learned what he needed to learn. He packs his gear and begins the hike back to the road, intending to return to society and perhaps reunite with his sister, Corrine. However, when he reaches the banks of the Taclanica River, he is met with a nightmare. The small, knee-deep stream he crossed with ease in April has been transformed by the summer snowmelt into a wide, violent, and deep torrent of glacial water. The current is far too strong to swim, and there is no obvious way across. Chris is trapped. He is terrified, realizing for the first time that his life is in genuine danger. He is forced to return to the bus, his hope of escape completely shattered. He is now a prisoner of the land land he sought to conquer. His food supplies are almost non-existent. He has finished his last bag of rice, and the local hunting has become poor as the animals move to higher ground. He is becoming skeletal, his ribs protruding through his skin and his energy levels plummeting. He begins to forage desperately for any edible plants he can find, turning to his field guide with a sense of urgency. He is looking for seeds and roots that can provide enough calories to keep his failing body alive, but his strength is fading fast. Desperate for any form of sustenance, Chris gathers a large quantity of wild potato seeds. He believes they are safe based on his book, but he makes a fatal error in identification, or perhaps he fails to realize that the seeds at this specific stage of growth contain a toxic alkaloid. The toxin acts as a metabolic inhibitor, essentially preventing his body from absorbing nutrients from whatever other food he manages to find. He begins to starve from the inside out, even as he continues to eat. His condition deteriorates rapidly over the next several days. He spends his final days lying in his blue sleeping bag inside the bus, too weak to hunt, forage, or even stand up. During these final, agonizing days, Chris undergoes a profound spiritual transformation. He reads a passage in a book by Boris Pasternak that leads him to a final, shattering truth. In the margin of the book, with a shaky, dying hand, he writes, "Happiness only real when shared. All the philosophy, the rejection of society, and the search for raw truth led him back to the very thing he thought he didn't need, human connection." He realizes that his journey was incomplete because he had no one to share the beauty of the world with. He understands that his parents, despite their deep flaws and mistakes, were the people who truly loved and knew him. In his dying moments, the walls he built between himself and the rest of humanity finally crumble, replaced by a sense of total forgiveness. In his last hours, Chris prepares for the end with a sense of quiet grace. He writes a final note on a piece of cardboard, which he places in the window of the bus. "I have had a happy life and thank the Lord. Goodbye and may God bless all." He crawls into his blue sleeping bag, the one his mother, Billy, had made for him years ago, and looks out the window of the bus at the vast, beautiful Alaskan sky. He has a vision of himself running into the arms of his mother and father, finally finding the peace and reconciliation he sought. He dies in August 1992, 19 days before his body is discovered by a group of moose hunters. The film ends with a real-life photograph of Christopher McCandless, found in his camera. He is standing outside the bus, holding his final note and smiling into the lens. He is gaunt and clearly dying, but his eyes are clear and peaceful. He died in the wild, but he died having finally found the truth he was looking for. That love is the only thing that gives life meaning. Christopher McCandless was a seeker who pushed the boundaries of human endurance to find a world that made sense. And in the end, he discovered that the world only makes sense when we are connected to one another. His story remains a polarizing but powerful testament to the human spirit's desire for freedom and the tragic, beautiful complexity of the search for a meaningful life.